So good afternoon, everyone. I think of you already joined. Let's start. Continue from the last part we left. We were talking about the interest rate risk and how the actually interest rate risk and how the changes in interest rate triggered by different factors. And we know that the interest rate movements and changes happen due to the demand and supply of the loanable funds and supply of the money supply itself, and how the money supply is changed by different regulations of monetary policy, by different tools. We discussed them all. And the last thing we were talking about, the repricing gap. We said there are three methods to measure. One is the repricing gap model, or funding gap, the maturity model, and the duration model. So these three models are related to interest rate. But in this chapter, we're going to deal only with the repricing gap model. And we said the repricing gap model, it concentrates on the impact of the interest rate changes on financial institutions' net interest income. That makes it, that comes from actually the difference between income and the expenses of interest. And we said there are some maturity buckets that should be considered by banks, like 1 day, more than 1 day to 3 months, from 3 months to 6 months, from 6 to 12 months, from 1 year to 5 years, and over the 5 years. And we do take into consideration rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities, and we define the rate sensitivity as that asset or liability is repriced at near or current market interest rate within a certain time horizon or maturity bucket, which is here. And the example we considered here, like 1 day, from 1 day to 3 months, from 3 months to 6 months, from 6 to 12, and so it's given. So it calculates the gap, and there's another column that calculates the cumulative gap itself. And to find what will be the impact on the interest income, we need to just multiply the gap by changing interest rate. Okay, this is what we get it. If you're asked, let's say, to calculate, please, what will be the change of net interest income if you take into consideration the maturity only 1 day instruments, that you're only interested in 1 day instrument repricing gap, then you will consider only this. So the example was the 1 day bucket gap is 10 million, like is negative number, and any changes in interest rate, like rise by 1%, that will reduce the net interest income by $100,000. So 10 million of gap, showing that rate sensitive liabilities are greater than the rate sensitive assets. So the gap is calculated between the difference between the rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities. So RCA minus RCL will give you this gap. And cumulative gap, you're just accumulating all the maturity buckets. So in here, we can understand that negative gap will lead to a reduction in the net interest income if interest rate increases. So example 2, let's consider the cumulative of 1 year gap. Okay, 1 year gap. So we need to get the cumulative one. So we need to consider like the 1 year gap. What will be the 1 year if there is interest rate changes? How it may affect the liquidity position or the financial position of the company or any institution within the 1 year, with taking into consideration the repricing gap of 1 year. So now 1 year, I mean here, look, 1 year from 6 months to 12 months, which is 20. It's a positive number in here. It's just for those financial instruments that are maturing from 6 to 12 months. They are having the positive gap. However, we said, okay, let's have everything until 1 year. So until this point, everything until this point. So how are we going to calculate? We're just going to sum everything. Let's say we accumulate all the gaps. We're going to come up with minus 15 million. Okay, minus 15 million. So 1% increase definitely will reduce your net interest income by $150,000. So your $150,000 will be reduction in net interest income if there's 1% year gap is taken into consideration, and just 1% changes, and it will really have a huge effect. So the rate sensitive assets are examples of hypothetical balance sheet, like short-term consumer loans. If they're repriced at the year end and would just make 1 year cutoff. And 3 months T-bills, they're repriced at maturity every 3 months. The 6-month T-notes, they're repriced on maturity every 6 months. And 30 years floating rate mortgages, they're repriced every 9 months. So we should take into consideration the balance sheet assets that are provided with. So in what if it's 30-year floating rate and you're asked 1 year gap, then you should take into consideration this 30-year rate, because it is repriced every 9 months. So we're gonna have some examples, so then you would better understand. So rate sensitive liabilities are bucketed in the same manner as the rate sensitive assets. So demand deposit and passbook saving account warrant special mention. So general considered as rate sensitive, but there are arguments for this inclusion as rate sensitive liability. So there's some like the core deposit there should not be included, but some financial institutions, they do include it actually. Here we are given the example, let's say. What can you see that short-term consumer loans on the asset side is 1 year maturity, like within the 1 year gap, like 2 year maturity within the, we have 3 months treasury bills, 6 months treasury notes, 3-year treasury bonds, 10-year fixed rate, and 30-year floating rate. So if I ask, let's say, please find the gap for 9 months, okay? So you need to find the rate sensitive assets for 9 months that is repriced, and rate sensitive liabilities for 9 months. So you need to find the gap for 9 months, maturity bracket. So what you will consider, first of all, this you will not consider because it's 1 year maturity. Long-term consumer loans you will not consider, it's a 2-year maturity. 3 months T-bills you will consider. 6 months treasury notes you will consider because it is included in this 9 months maturity bracket. 3-year treasury bonds not included. 10-year fixed rate mortgages not included. 30-year floating rate mortgages, which is adjusted every 9 months. So it is just falls within that parameter. So our rate sensitive asset is 1, 2, 3. So if you added them up, like 65 to 105, so our rate sensitive asset will be equal to 105. So let's see what we have as liability side. So demand deposits, passbook saving 3 months, and 3 month bankers acceptance, 6 month commercial papers, and 1 year time deposit, 2 year time deposit. If it's 9 months, so you should include everything until 9 months. So with some financial institutions, they do not consider time demand deposits, but passbook savings. So guys, we may consider these things like demand deposits, passbook savings, 3 month CDs, and 3 months bankers acceptance, and 6 months commercial papers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 5 things we're going to consider, but with
Excuse me, Professor. Yes. I have here a question. So how did you get 105? And why you include 30-year floating rate mortgages?
Okay, let me just go again. Why did I include 100? How did I get 105? I just used 3 months treasury bills. That falls within the 9 months maturity bracket. Then 6 month treasury notes is included as well. So 30 plus 35, which makes 65. Okay. And we proceed down. So we do not include this, but 30-year floating rate, guys. It's not fixed, it's a floating. That means it is adjusted every 9 months. So it just exactly falls within the parameter we just put. Like we say, we need 9 month gap. Okay. That means that we include this.
As I understood, every time when the rate is adjusted, we should include it, yes?
As it is floating. Okay, floating.
Yeah, as it's floating.
Floating, yeah. Adjusted every 9 months. So you should look for if I say 6 months, then you should not include this one. because it's adjusted, it's repriced every 9 months, so it's out of the schedule. So maybe useful to express cumulative gap ratio in the formula. So I'm gonna come to solve it, okay, with the example, so you will understand better. I'll go to the end of the chapter and we'll solve it. So cumulative gap ratio, so we can express it as ratio as well, like cumulative gap dividing by 270. It will show like 5.6% of, it shows kind of how much of exposure it provides first, and second it shows the direction. The direction we can see directly from the cumulative gap itself, if it's negative or positive. So if it's a cumulative gap is negative, that means if there is increase in the interest rate, then your net interest income will be going down. If it's a positive gap, increase in the interest rate will lead to increase in the net interest income. So, but one thing into consideration, guys, we said the gap is what? Is rate sensitive assets and minus rate sensitive liabilities. And we assume that it is changing equally, actually, okay? The change take the place equally. So it equal amount rate changes on rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities. So that's why we do ignore that. What if the change of interest rate happens differently on each side? Like on rate sensitive asset, it's different, and rate sensitive liability, it takes place differently. But if it's in here, expected annual change in net interest income, let's say it's cumulative gap, it's 15 million, it's a positive number, okay? It's a positive number, and times by 1%, and that will increase your net interest income by 150,000. With positive gap and net interest income move in the same direction. However, if you change the proportional to cumulative gap, and you will see that if it's negative number, it will change differently. But what if it's 2%? You just change it by 2% here. You just put 0.02, and you will see by how much it changes, like this 50 million. If interest rate raises by 2%, let me just calculate 15 million times 0.02. So it's just double of it, 300,000, okay? Just double of it is gonna have 300,000 increase. So what if unequal changes in rate takes the place? Like if changes in the rate on rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities are not equal, and this spread change in this case, so 1.2% increases on the left side and 1% increases on the right side of the balance sheet, and this will change happen. Okay, and this will have the net interest income. In this case, it is very difficult to predict. As we said, if the gap is, let's say, negative increase in the interest rate, that will lead to decrease in the net interest income. However, when it's unequally rated, is unequally adjusted asset and liability, so the changes in interest rate will not be telling you the direction or in accordance with the cumulative gap or gap ratio itself. Why? Because what is the matter in here? The proportion change in the asset side and the proportion change in the liability side. If the proportion change in the asset will be greater than the proportion change in the liability, then we can find out the kind of direction. So rate sensitive asset, let's say we got negative here, okay? We got negative gap. That means increase in interest rate should lead to reduction in net interest income. This is what we know it, okay? If there's a negative gap. However, if the unequally rated rate sensitive asset and rate sensitive liability, it will be kind of different. if in this case, we can see that we should be very careful about it, okay? How it's affecting the rate sensitive asset and how it's affecting rate sensitive liability. So we're gonna have the example here. So in here we can see to come up with a certain gap, we need to find how it's treated actually, how it's rated. So that's why we need to have a certain calculation in it. So you cannot use this rule. You cannot use this rule when the rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities are rated at different rates. So restructuring the asset liabilities, if I can restructure the asset liabilities or as well restructure the off balance sheet to benefit from projected interest rate changes. So having positive gap and negative gap, like increasing the interest rates and negative gap when the interest rate decreases so that it may have some positive income if you project accurately the changes of the interest rate. So in this way, these things you should keep in mind. However, you should take the reality because the rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities are rated at different rates.
Professor,
yes.
What is meant by structure of assets and liabilities?
Sorry?
What is meant by the structure of assets and liabilities?
Changing, for example, now you'd say simply, I mean, explain you. You have rate sensitive assets, okay, is greater than rate sensitive liabilities. Okay, and that will bring you to a positive gap, isn't it? If this is the case, that means if interest rate increases, that will increase your net interest income. However, let's say you predicted that within coming 3 months, the interest rate will fall. That means falling of interest rate will bring your net interest income down. That will bring net interest income down. If you keep this position, okay, if you keep this position, the if the interest rate falls and net interest income will go down. But if you predict that the interest rate will fall, as a financial manager, you have to restructure your assets and liabilities. You have to change the maturity, the asset that you hold, you have to sell it and convert into liabilities, get more liabilities, make it a negative gap, okay? From positive to negative gap. This is what it means here, the restructuring.
Kind of manipulating, right?
Yeah, yeah. In order to come up with your aim is to have a profit, to increase the net interest income. And one thing you know that positive gap is if interest rate increases, that will bring your net interest income to up. If negative gap, decrease in the interest rate, that will bring your increase in net interest income. So you have to take this in consideration. But this is the case only when changes of interest rate will have the same effect on rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities. So rate sensitive assets is 500 million, rate sensitive liability is 400 million, and the bank has got the positive gap of 100 million. So if interest rate rises, bank interest income will go up. If interest rate falls, the net interest will decline as interest revenue from assets drop by more than the interest expenses associated with the liability. So bank with a positive gap will lose net interest income if interest rate falls. So now let's say this is your position. Now you have to predict if it falls or increase. If it falls in the future, then you have to restructure it in order to make your net interest income to go up. Okay, there is another example like Hurley Savings Financial Corporation at the end of the 2008. 1 year gap ratio was 1.45%. The 3-year gap ratio was 3.95%. If interest rate rose in 2009, it would experience a large increase in net interest income because it was a positive gap, okay? And however, the interest rate did not increase that time. The commercial, why? Because that time it was the time to make the demand to work, to stimulate the demand, to increase the motivation of the people to purchase more goods and services. To do that, they should reduce the interest rate, either through the open market operation or discount rate. Zero interest sensitive gap. If interest sensitive asset and liability of the bank are equal, the bank is relatively kind of insulated from interest rate risk. And in the case interest rate revenue and funding costs will change at the same rate, the bank's gap is zero. So this is kind of aggressive rate sensitive gap management to you. Expected change in the interest rate, like if interest rate increases, if you have positive gap, that will increase in asset and decrease in liability, will lead to net interest income to increase. So this is the vice versa place taking the place. Okay, so this kind of management gap for you to use it as seen if the condition we're assuming that change of interest rate on both will be the same on asset and the liability side. So the weakness of the repricing model, it ignores the market value effect of interest rate changes, because we said everything, it's repriced from its book value. It is always facing the mismatches within the brackets that can be substantial, and it ignores the effects of runoffs. Bank continuously originate and retire the consumer and the mortgage loans, so they don't take it into consideration. And another weakness is that off-balance sheet items are not included in hedging effects of the balance sheet items, and not captured actually here, like future contracts, option contracts, the warrants are not included in repricing gap. This is the main part. You know that liquidity position of the bank is by research is conducted saying that the liquidity position by banks are affected by more of balance sheet items as well in some countries. So the off balance sheet items cannot be ignored. So let me go through the questions. So consider the following balance sheet position. We have rate sensitive asset 200 million and rate sensitive liabilities 100 million. Then rate sensitive is 100, 150, 150 and 140. So we have some listed rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities. So in here we are asked to calculate repricing gap and impact on the net interest income if 1% increase in interest rate. So we need to make calculation for each. So in here, so rate sensitive asset minus rate sensitive liability will give you. So when we subtract
Positive gap.
Positive gap, very true. So what happens if it's positive gap?
So if interest rate changes, then it brings us positive net interest income.
Very true. And which means 1%, 1 times 100, it will be 1 million of income. So net interest income, the change in net interest income will be make a equal sign. Okay. Okay, let's move. Now, rate sensitive assets is 100 million and rate sensitive liability is 150 million. So in here we have
Negative.
negative. So negative gap of 50 million. So if it's 50 million, increase in interest rate, how it is going to affect?
Negatively.
Negatively. So our net interest income will go down by, if you time by 1% or 50 million, it should be like 500,000. So 50,000 times 0.01, it will be 5. So in here,
Negative also. Minus 10 million. Oh, I'm sorry.
it's
Positive.
positive.
Ah, I'm sorry. Positive plus 10
10
million.
10 million. So our net change in net interest income will be up,
Positive.
positive. It will increase by 1 million. No, sorry, by 100,000. So this is first part, calculating the A. So calculate the impact of net interest income above the situation, assume the decrease. So this the same thing, but with opposite. Okay. Same with
Okay.
opposite. So here we have a positive gap, but interest rate reduction. What is the impact on net interest income if interest rate falls?
So, excuse me, we should divide it, right? To 1%.
No, no, no.
Okay.
It falls as well.
So in here, look, in first case, interest increased, okay? Let me make it like this. First case, interest increased. Second case, interest reduced. So in first case, net interest income increased because interest increased because of the positive gap. But in the second case, in reduction in the interest rate, what impact it may have on net interest income? What will happen to your net interest income?
It will be decreased.
Yes, because reduction in interest rate, it brings a negative sign. So it reduces the net interest income. So in this case, we have a negative gap here and interest reduction. What is the effect? What will be the effect?
Net interest income will increase.
Net interest income will increase. Very true, because negative gap will increase the net interest income. So negative and negative interest rate will bring. Let me give you an example to understand, to make you understand better. So in here we calculate gap is equal to 100 minus 150, which is minus 100, and interest
Minus 50.
yeah, thank you minus 50, but that's just by automatically 100. So interest reduction by 1%, which is minus 0.01 times minus 50. So you should have a positive number in here.
Ah, okay, I got it.
Which is $500,000, which is 5 or 0.5 thousand. So it's $500,000 increase in the money. So because you have more liabilities on your side than the asset, that if changing the interest rate, where you will get benefits, like if it's reduced. What about second one, the last one here? $150 minus 140, we have positive gap, and reduction in interest will bring us.
The decrease of net interest income.
Yes, very true. So our net interest income will go down.
So it doesn't matter, right? Is interest rate decrease or increase? Anyway, we should multiply each other, right? So there is no dividing, nothing, right?
No. There is no division, nothing related to division, just multiplication. We're trying to see how it affects negative and positive kind of change. So
Okay.
what conclusion can you draw about the repricing model from these results? So FIs in part 1 and part 3, I mean, let me just clear. So FIs, So this is part 1, this is part 2, this is part 3, okay? This is part 1, part 2, part 3. So we have positive gap here, negative gap, and positive gap, okay? And taking into consideration the rules, if positive gap, that will increase in asset and decrease in liabilities. That will give you more net interest income. If there's a negative gap, decrease in assets and increase in liabilities. So this is what you should keep in mind. Now, exposed to interest rate declines with a positive repricing gap, okay? The first and the second. So the interest rate risk for the positive gap, and what is the risk? What is the thing they are afraid of in the first and the third case is when the interest rate falls. Because that time the net interest income will fall. While in second part with the negative gap, financial institution is exposed to the interest rate risk when the interest rate increases. So in this case, increase in interest rate, increasing the interest rate will bring down the net interest income. Look at the rules. Falling the interest rate and increasing the interest rate. So there should be a third case, like if it's rising and the negative interest rate. So in the book, there is a case. If you go with the book, there is a table. I really like it. I had to put it actually. I didn't put it. So here, what happens? But change, you know, it's for spread change. It's different. We're going to talk about it when the interest changes. But now we're talking about if the interest rate changes with the same way. Look here. This is the table I'm talking. In here it says that cumulative gap, if it's more than 0 and interest rate increases, change in interest revenue will increase more than change in interest expense. That will bring the interest income up. Net interest income go up. If cumulative gap is more than 0, positive, change in interest rate falls down. That will bring changes in interest revenue more down than changes in interest revenue in expense. So that will bring your net interest income down. If the opposite, if your cumulative gap is negative and increase in interest rate, that will increase your revenue less than expenses. That will bring your net interest income down. If cumulative gap is less than 0, it's a negative, and interest rate falls, that means that reduction or fall in revenue will be less than fall in expenses. That will increase your change in net interest income. So this is the explanation of the conclusion we can draw on here. So the FIs in the part 3 has the lowest interest rate risk exposure since the absolute value of repricing gap is the lowest, while the opposite is true for the part 1. So in here, the ideal point is when there is a 0 repricing gap, okay? Ideally it should be 0. So there shouldn't be any huge differences between rate sensitive assets and rate sensitive liability, because the financial institutions are less willing to put themselves into the risk. Okay, keep in mind the ideal point when there is a 0 sensitive repricing gap, because change in the interest rate will have a 0 change, and the less and the least interest rate risk exposure has the third part, because it has got the lowest actually repricing part. The repricing gap is lowest in here. It's a 10 here, 50 here, and 100 here. So the highest exposure in first part, the lowest exposure in the third part. Am I clear, guys? This is very important to understand the logic, the highest exposure and the lowest exposure. If something is not clear, let me know. I will explain it again. The relationship between the first, second, and third part. The third part has got the lowest exposure to the interest rate risk, and the first one has got the highest exposure to the interest rate risk changes. Okay, let us move. Okay, let's say we're given rates in here. Now, guys, this is the example that I wanted to talk to you more, because in here we have we can see that interest rate changes differently. So interest rate affects on asset and liability side differently. So on asset side, we can see that floating rate mortgages, and currently it's 10% annually, which means it's repriced every 1 year. And we have 30-year fixed rate loans, and currently is repriced at 7%. It's repriced, okay? It's repriced, okay? Still is being repriced every year. On the liability side, we have 1-year time deposit is repriced at 6% annually, and 3-year time deposit, which is repriced at 7% annually. So what is the expected net interest income at the end of the year? So we need to take into consideration the maturity bracket, which is 1 year. So MB will be equal 1. How we do it? So for part A, first of all, we need to find expected interest, expected interest income. So interest income is equal to 50 million times 0.10 plus 50 million times 0.07. This will give us expected interest income. If you calculate 50 times and in total, just let me calculate it. So 50, it's 5 million here, and 3.5, okay, 8.5. So 8.5 million. We have it here.
Excuse me, Professor.
Yes, please.
Why here we didn't consider liabilities?
Wait. We didn't come here to it's we are now doing the rate sensitive assets. Okay, this is we call the rate sensitive assets. Now we are coming to rate sensitive liabilities. This is rate sensitive asset. Okay.
Okay.
Now we're going to interest expense, which is liability part. Okay. And on the liability part, which is we're going to consider 70 times. I didn't put the time in here, okay. 0.06 and plus 20 times 0.07. And if you calculate it, 4.2, and this is 1.4 in total. 5.6 million, 5.6 million of dollars. We have it on rate sensitive liability. And net, so our expected interest net interest income is equal to 8.5 minus 5.6 will give us 2.9 million of dollars. So if interest rate increases differently, you see what happens? Okay. If you can play with this, we're gonna play with that. Okay, guys. Now we have part B. In the part B, we'll see what happens if the interest rate increases in a different manner. So in here, we can see that how it affects if the interest rate increase in the one direction for asset and liability, but with a different proportion. This is part A. Okay. This is A. Now let's go with the B. In the B part, what will be net interest income by the end of the year if interest rate rises by 2%? So your turn to help me, please. We calculate the interest income 50 times
0.12.
12, very good, plus 50 times
0.09.
9,
0.9.
very nice, and 50 times 0.9. So we have 10.5, and interest income expense, sorry, is 70 times, help me, 0.8 plus 20
multiplied 0.9.
9.
So if you multiply this, we should have 70 times 8 plus 20 times, so 7.
7.4 million.
7.4. And net interest income will be 10.5 minus 7.4
Equals to 3.1.
3.1. Now you see the effect?
Yes.
How it's changed? And it increased by 2% in equal proportional amount in asset side and liability side, but the net interest income, it increased more. It became more. Okay, let's go further. Part C, using the cumulative repricing gap model, what is the expected net interest income for 2% increase in interest rates? So let us use the cumulative gap. So repricing funding gap is wait a second. So let us use the cumulative gap model. So how we do the cumulative gap model, who can remind me? So now we need to deal with a 2% increase using the cumulative gap model. Here's the table, balance sheet, okay?
Net interest income equals to,
First, we need to find the gap.
Yeah.
Okay, tell me how we find the gap.
rate sensitive assets minus rate sensitive liabilities.
And our rate sensitive asset, which is floating rate mortgages, because fixed are not the rate sensitive assets. So 50. What about the liability?
So it's 90, yes?
No, it should be up to 1 year. Okay, 1 year.
Ah, up to 1 year, 70.
Up to 1 year, 70. Which is minus 20. And minus 20. Increase in interest rate. What will be the change in net interest income?
It will decrease.
We should multiply by 2.
Minus 20 times 0.02. So
2.
20 million, which is minus 0.4. Oops, sorry, 0.4 million. Now, okay. Now, this is part C. This is part C. And okay. What will the net interest income be at the year end if interest rate on rate sensitive asset increased by 2%, but interest in rates on increased by 1%? Is it reasonable for the changes in interest rate of sensitive liabilities to differ, and why? Waiting. Think a bit. What if interest rate on RCA increased by 2% and rate sensitive liability increased just by 1%? Is it reasonable for the changes?
It's unreasonable.
Think, guys. I mean, do not confuse with the part C, okay? Nothing to do with the part C. Part C is just assuming that it's equally changing, okay? They just gap. But we are talking about if it's changing in non-equal amount, non-equal manner. So we should consider this, okay? In here, in part B, you remember it increased by 2% on both sides.
Yes.
But in here in part D, it says it will increase by 2% in income, but it will be increasing in expense side by only 1%. So do you think that the net interest income will be higher or lower?
It will be
It will be
higher.
higher.
Give me your clarification. Give me a clarification for your answer. Why it's going to be higher?
Simply mathematically, when you multiply by the higher number, you will get a higher result. And then the difference between them going to be like the spread is bigger.
Yeah, the spread itself will be bigger. That's true, because the change of interest rate in asset side is bigger, and that will bring us more revenue. That will have more effect of net interest income. So our net interest income will increase, and it will be higher than this amount.
It will also increase the exposure, right? Exposure.
Yeah, there is an interest rate exposure. What kind of exposure we may expect in this situation? If it was the gap, with a negative gap, cumulative gap, then we can say that positive interest increase can make us to be exposed to the interest rate risk, but negative, it's opposite. However, if it's interest rate changes, it's different actually. You know, it depends by how much it's going to change. If interest rate increase, keep in mind, in this case, if interest rate increase, not to be exposed to interest rate risk, the change on asset side should be higher than change on liability side. If interest rate increases on opposite way, like changes on liabilities higher than on the asset side, that will bring us to interest rate exposure. This is what we're afraid of, okay? When the interest rate is affecting rate sensitive asset and rate sensitive liability with a different interest rate amount. Okay, guys, I would like to stop here. Do you have any questions?
No, thank you.
So, Professor, so
Yes.
what was the final answer for D?
Final answer for the D that we calculated. If you calculate, you're gonna just put like 50 times 12. This will be remaining. So interest income will be the same, like 10.5 million, and interest expense
It
will
will
be
be 6.5 million. I calculated it.
how much?
6.5 million. Then net interest income will equal to 6 million. I'm sorry, 4 million. Net interest income equals to 4 million.
So net interest income is equal to 4 million. Okay. Okay, let me read the question again. What will be net interest income be at the end of the interest sensitive assets and rate sensitive liabilities? I see. Now, guys, kinda we're confused here. Now I understand here. Okay, the problem is here is asking rate sensitive assets, not just interest income change. Okay, if it's rate sensitive asset, that means we should consider only the up to 1 year. Okay, the floating rate and deposit side. That means that it will change only in here. It will be. Yes, I didn't read the question. Okay, 50 times 0.12 plus 50 times 0.7. This 7% is not changed. It is as previously because it is not as rate. This is not the rate sensitive asset. The rate sensitive assets, like they are those assets that are either floating rate or it should be annual based, okay, up to 1 year. So only what is changes, it changes, like we are making only change on rate sensitive assets here. Then when it comes to the interest expense, it should be 70 times 0.07 plus 20 times 0.07. So only what it changes the rate sensitive asset and rate sensitive liability up to 1 year. So our net interest income, if you calculate here 9.5, and here we should have, just a second, 70, it's 4.9 plus 6.3 million. And our net interest income, 9.5 million, 6.3 is equal to.
Sorry, once more. Why is it 50 you multiply by 0.07?
Here.
No, in the first one.
In the first one. Okay.
Interest income.
Just a second. Let me put it here so that we can. Now, when we say rate sensitive assets, we do only consider this part. Okay, this only floating. The fixed rate cannot be a sensitive asset, okay? Because it's fixed and it's fixed for long. And
Mhm.
for liabilities as well, it's up to 1 year deposits. Okay, and in the question it says, what if the rate sensitive asset and rate sensitive liability changes? That means that this and this will be same, like 7% here and 7% in here. If you see here, 50 times 0.7, which is this 7 we're talking about, and 7% this. Oh, sorry, not that one. 7% of this. So 20 and this 50, they are fixed, which is more than 1 year, and they are not rate sensitive asset and they are not rate sensitive liability. That's why increase in interest rate, it affects only this part. It said that rate sensitive assets will have effect of 2% increase interest, and rate sensitive liability will have effect of 1% increase of interest. So that means that this was 6%, is this one should be 7. This is 10%, increased by 2% should be 10 or 12, from 10 to 12. Did I answer your question?
Yes, yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.
Okay. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
See you.